All right. Well, I told you I was going to get into Stanley Hauerwas at the beginning of the new year. And to kind of get that going today, I just want to introduce Hauerwas and a few of his ideas. I'm going to start in with Christian Existence Today, Essays on Church, World, and Living in Between. And then I also have a book, A Community of Character, Toward a Constructive Christian Social Ethic. So I'll be drawing from both of those books at least. And I just did a little bit of research on my own to try to get a feel for Hauerwas. I'm writing a book which requires me to delve more deeply into theology and political theology in particular, and Hauerwas was recommended to me by my publisher, Whitfenstock. So actually, I'll put a link to Whitfenstock in the notes below. Their catalog is pretty interesting, and I'm glad that I'm going to be a part of their, if I finish this book, which I will, I always finish my books, to be a part of their, whatever you call it, gaggle of authors. So Hauerwas is famous for this statement: the first task of the church is to make the world the world. And I gather what he means by that is that the church shouldn't look like the world. Christians should be able to distinguish between the church and the world. So if the church starts to look like the world, like for instance this mega church here, that looks like a football stadium, even visually that kind of gives you the sense that there's just a little bit too much of the world going on there. But it's not just the look, but the way of organizing, the way of acting. I know I've gotten on this before a few times, so if you've been with me for a while, you're familiar. The more that a church acts like a business, the more it is like the world. And so Hauerwas wants a church that understands that they are not the world and adopts practices that are different from it, which then will give the people in it a notion of what they're facing, a perspective, a position from which to view the world and to think about what they want to do in it and with it, which they can't have if they're totally immersed in it. So who is Stanley Hauerwas? I sort of was predisposed to like this guy because he sounds like some of my relatives. My dad is in his 90s. He comes from Kentucky. And actually, Stanley Hauerwas looks and sounds like some of my dad's relatives. Not so much like my dad. He has a particular voice. You might want to Google Hauerwas and just listen to his voice a little bit. He's got a southern accent. He comes from Texas. He was born in Texas. And one of the first essay in this book has to do with being a Texan and the difference between being a Texan and being a Christian, and how you how those two things can go together as stories in a person's life. So he comes from Texas. He was the son of a bricklayer who, from a fairly early age, was being trained by his father to do the same. Now, I've tried to read several biographies, including, of course, the Wikipedia article on him, but I looked at his own, what says it's the official Stanley Hauerwas website and a few other places. It's very difficult, actually, to find anything too biographical about Hauerwas, and that must be on purpose. But it does come out, and he has written about his own life a bit. But what I haven't been able to get is how did he go from being trained by his father to be a bricklayer, which is a skilled trade, which he still respects greatly and says he learned a lot from, to going to Yale and getting a PhD in theology. Okay, it's not clear to me, even after reading them, how that happened. And so I want to read more about it, but I think that it's indicative of Hauerwas's own, personality, that it's not easy to find. And he hasn't emphasized this journey of his. But almost for that reason, I find it a really compelling aspect. Unlike some authors where I really don't and maybe shouldn't care too much about their background, I find Hauerwas's background to be really quite quite worth knowing. It adds credibility to what he has to say. He comes from this type of working class origin. He knows how to work very hard with his hands. Somehow he ends up at Yale. He's obviously brilliant as I'm reading his work. He's one of those authors that you have to slow down and read twice, if not more. And so, he's got a good brain. And so I gather this must have had a lot to do with how opportunities opened for him along the way. But he ended up at the Duke School of Divinity. He has a lot of different jobs on his resume, but that's where he was until 2019. I think he's retired now, but he's not really retired. He's still writing. He's still, talking to people. He's in his lower 80s. An interesting fact that it wouldn't come out unless you really did some digging like I did is that Hauerwas has been married twice. The first marriage lasted quite a long time. I can't remember how many years, but it was maybe 15 to 20 years at least. Maybe I think it was over 20. And he got married to that first woman at a very young age before he really understood what marriage was all about, and he really didn't know her very well. And as it turned out, she had bipolar, manic depression type of mental illness. And literally, from what I did read from interviews with him, as well as other people writing about his life, it was abusive in the sense that, he would be yelled at, he would be accused of things. She would go around on him or try to, and he was sometimes afraid of her violence. And yet she was the person who eventually walked away from that marriage. So he endured many years of really an abusive relationship. He had one son by this woman, and I don't know how that turned out. And then she left, and he got a divorce. And so then he eventually found another woman who was intellectually, as well as in a religious sense, much closer to him. And that marriage has been, by all accounts, much more successful and much more compatible. So a happy ending in that case. But let's just say this, that Stanley Hauerwas has had a rough life, not an easy life. And at the same time, probably due to his natural brilliance, he was able to learn so much and to prove himself so brilliant that he was able to work his way up into a very great deal of influence. Some people call him the most prominent theologian that the United States has produced. So I just made a list of some of the characteristics that will come out in future videos, more characteristics of the way that Hauerwas thinks, and I'll just dwell briefly on them. But one thing that comes out immediately is that Hauerwas is anti-liberal. He calls himself, it's sometimes post-liberal. So he does not like the fact that so many Christians have sort of taken liberalism at face value. The idea of, I'm talking about the social contract way of thinking in which rational acting individuals with self-interest make a contract to form a government. They could be anybody. It's an ideology of the Enlightenment that is meant to apply to everybody because everybody is presumed to be a self-interested, rational acting individual with rights, whose primary mission in life is that of basically making profit and property. And so, Hauerwas resonates with me because I don't agree with, I don't agree that way of thinking has been beneficial to the human spirit. And it really has been very destructive to the lives of a lot of people around the world. I think it's time for us to get past it. I do think there was a time when probably, even though it exacted a great toll, that it elevated materially people beyond what they had been. And in some ways that was good, but in other ways it's become very, very bad as well. Anyway, so this is a characteristic of Hauerwas's way of thinking. He's post-liberal. And going along with that is an emphasis on the idea that human beings are storytelling people, or they base their meaning on narrative. Okay, now that he's not one of these postmodernists that says that there's no truth beyond the narrative. So if you got that in your head, try to get it out. The word narrative pushes people's buttons sometimes. That he is not, okay? But he's very, very centered on thinking that if you're a Christian, you think of Christ as the source of truth. And so the story of Christ is the narrative that Christians adopt that tells them about this truth, which is embedded in history because it was, because it's the story of the Jewish people that leads up to the birth of Christ, and then from then on the inclusion of the Gentiles and so on. And that's a historical story that Christians can adopt, okay? And then it becomes their story. But it's not an abstract philosophic proposition. It is a story. And so he insists, Christians buy into this story. If they do, then they locate Christ as the source of how we know God, and kind of like the measure of everything else, and to inform how people are supposed to think and act. So this is what I mean by the narrative story-based understanding. People are story creatures, and so they are captured by many stories, but this is a story that can counteract some of the other ones. One of the things that Hauerwas says is that a lot of people's stories, like being a Texan, can lead to violence, and often do, no matter what the story is, whether it's, I'm an Irish person, or I'm a Texan, or I'm a white person, or a Hispanic, or whatever it is that you derive your meaning from based upon the story, of that people. In order to keep that story alive, he says, you automatically have to assume that other stories are competing with that one. And you need to defend the meaningfulness and the supremacy of your story. The Christian story, rightly understood in his view, is a story that is kind of almost the antidote for all those other stories. Now, he doesn't say that it will erase those other stories, but because of its story, which culminates in Christ dying on the cross and thereby showing the nature of God, which is to absorb violence and to not throw it back out there, to not do it. Because of that story, if that is one's chief narrative, source of meaning, and everything else flows from that, the other narratives or stories that we have in our heads cannot turn towards violence because we have adopted an anti-violence story. So he's anti-Constantinian. What I mean by that is that, ever since about the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity as the official religion, Christianity, whether Catholic or Protestant, has tended to get in bed with or marry political power. And when that happens, the political power becomes predominant, and it infects the church, and it infects the Christian story. It warps that story, you might say. So it's not told correctly. And so he's against any sort of melding of political power with the church. Instead, the church has to be its own source of internal power, in the sense of its own community, its own kind of polity, as we'll see. He does think that Christianity, obviously he understands that Christianity has almost always been more or less co-opted by political power, and has all sorts of things wrong with it. all the time. But at the same time, he says that unlike some other systems, it has within it the potential for self-correction. So he keeps coming back to that point, that within it you have the figure of Christ as the paramount figure. And since we have a text that shows us the nature of Christ, we can't totally escape the words, as hard as people try, and they do, they do. But there's always this tendency, this ability to return to try to rediscover and get back to. And this is part of what makes this seem more true, to have more validity, is that there is this, you might say, check upon the worst tendencies of humanity through the actual message of Christ, which even after all this time still comes through if one actually reads the words of Christ and the description of what he did, what he said. So for Hauerwas, I think Christianity is an adoptable story, unlike these other stories that we are born into. The genuine Christianity gives you that story, which then if you adopt gives meaning in your life and gives you a context and a set of, more or less virtues and habits and ways of living that you can adopt, which can in some ways function as an ideology does for people. But the ideology will take you away from the truth into this realm of extremism in a way that Christianity, rightly understood anyway, cannot, because of the core central figure of it, okay, of Christ. So his bigger point here is that without the Christian story, other stories, such as birth stories or ideologies, are inherently dangerous because they tend towards the violence and extremism of circling around the wagons and protecting. But the true Christianity won't allow people to do that because of the nature of Christ. Okay. Now, obviously, it's really easy for people to forget the nature of Christ. The nature of Christ is so incredibly challenging to our way of life that it's like painful to even contemplate the difference between the two. And so people tend to run away a lot from that. And I think a lot of Hauerwas's work and life has been around insisting that people look at it and not run away and ask themselves, what would life be like if we really took this challenge, if we really stepped away from the world and moved into the space of more genuine Christianity. This is a quote from the book Christian Existence Today that kind of illustrates this Texan versus Christianity point. The most decisive difference and challenge the story being a Christian entails for being a Texan is its prohibition on the use of coercion to sustain its truth. The followers of Jesus can attract others to the way of Jesus only by living faithful lives, faithful to Jesus. Indeed, they must learn to make the story of Jesus their own in a manner that makes clear that they would rather lose their lives than sustain that story through violence. Not to live in such a way would deny the very character of that story as the story of a God who we believe is the truth of our existence. If he is such, then violence in the name of truth cannot help but deny that it is the truth we have come to know. And then he follows that by saying, to live in this manner strikes at the heart of our illusions, underwritten by many of the stories that grip our lives, not the least of which is that we have no story. By that he's referencing liberalism. And are thus necessarily sustained by violence, made righteous in the name of cause, country, family, or ideal. So really, it's very challenging thinking, right, that almost everybody shrinks from. I think it was Nietzsche who said that in his estimation, the only Christian who had ever existed was Christ. And Nietzsche admired Christ because he lived like he talked. And Of course, no one else has ever quite achieved that. But I think that Nietzsche was extremely disappointed with the record of Christianity, and that helped him to draw the conclusions. A lot of Christians think of Nietzsche as the practically the devil incarnate, but you have to ask yourself what role Christians played in making Nietzsche Nietzsche. So there's that. Anyway, here are a few more characteristics of Hauerwas. He's anti-nationalistic, which shouldn't be any surprise based on what I've already said. And he's pacifistic, same thing. He draws a lot of his thought on pacifism from Anabaptist thought and practice. So we'll get into that more in future videos. He is pro-virtue ethics, and in fact, he says he learned a lot from Alasdair MacIntyre. And I've done quite a lot of work on this channel on Alasdair MacIntyre, so you might want to look for my playlist on MacIntyre if you want to know more about his book, After Virtue. But virtue ethics is the idea of a community supported and kind of enforced habitual ethics that we learn by living and by doing, not just by thinking and reasoning. So again, we'll get more into that. But I'll leave you with this. Hauerwas, and that by the way, that picture is not Hauerwas, that's Alasdair MacIntyre. But anyway, Hauerwas thinks the church ought to be an alternative community or polis, that there is a kind of politics of the church. And it's exemplified by, for instance, the Mennonites. He tells a story of the Mennonites in this book, and about how even when one of their children was accidentally killed by a bunch of teenage hooligans throwing stones into their car, the Mennonites refused to go to court, so the teenagers weren't charged with very much. Mennonites refused to sue other people in court, too. And they have their own way of handling things, and he goes into that, how they try to handle accusations in their own community in a way in which the accuser is confronted and where forgiveness and reconciliation are key. But the pressure of the community is pretty strong in that process. It reminds me of communitarian thought, right? That the community exercises its own sort of enforcement mechanism in the expectations and the belonging and sense of loss of belonging if one violates those expectations too far, but centering around reconciliation and forgiveness in an attempt to keep people within the community, comfortable within the community. So anyway, I just have gotten started. If I said anything wrong, it's because I don't yet know Hauerwas all that well. I just noticed right now that Wittgenstock is the publisher of this book, Christian Existence Today, hey, which is the publisher that I'm going to be working with. So I'm super stoked about being in such excellent company. It's kind of nice. So anyway, that's all for this time. And I'm excited to get started. I hope that next year for everybody is better than this year. I definitely do. Bye.